So first of all, I think it's important to note that I'm not a teacher, I'm not a practitioner, I'm not a guru. I know that, and I'm just really sharing my experience of this subject matter area. I think even in the spiritual community, even though one would hope that we're all kind of chilled out and zen and insightful, I think there's still quite a lot of rivalry, a lot of criticism, a lot of cliques, power battles. I think I'm very fortunate that in our community, we're sort of very open to listening to one another, and, you know, all criticism is very constructive. But I appreciate that this is, you know, a subject matter area that a lot of people are actually quite passionate about and informed about, and will have had different experiences. So some of the things that I say, you know, I might say that this is what will happen. That's just my opinion, and that's from my own experience. And, you know, you're obviously welcome to challenge me if you wish to, but from my perspective, it's not really necessary. You know, I'm not trying to do like a how-to video or a tutorial video. I just think it's important to get that out of the way to begin with. So light magic, what is it? Well, I think it's got a very fairy tale or Tolkien-esque association. I wouldn't normally think of it in those terms, but I've kind of described it that way so that I can convey it to you. So, you know, we've got like white witches, grey witches and black witches, you know, in sort of folklore and many sort of movies that you'll see. I don't really subscribe to that, but, you know, for the purposes of just making it simple to talk about, let's just say that I would describe myself, if I had to, as being more of a grey witch, more of a grey pagan. So what does that mean? It means that whilst I usually would be considered by some to be more of a light worker, someone that works with energy for good intentions, for want of a better term, I also will dabble in the darker side if necessary. And that if necessary is like a big if. And I'm going to talk about that more in my second video. So when we're talking about light magic, we're mainly talking about things that are benevolent, healing work, things that mainly just affect ourselves. Although I would argue that even when we change something in relation to our own lives, that usually has like a butterfly effect, doesn't it? When it comes to talking about the darker sides of magical workings, it's not something that I encourage. You'll see that in my disclaimer. You know, I'm against baneful magic. You know, I would never get a high from wishing ill on someone else, and I certainly don't encourage that in this community. Something that I did want to say is, and I don't know how the community feels about this, but the term sort of white magic, black magic, I am concerned that those terms can be potentially racist these days, and that's another reason why I don't use those terms. You know, I don't always like the connotation that everything that's white is good and everything that's black is bad. I think that's a very dangerous territory to go into. I think it's very old-fashioned. So that's another reason why I don't tend to work with those terms. But let's say, you know, that light is more in relation to, say, pure sunlight, and dark is more about the energy, the shadow. That's kind of what I'm speaking about, or what, you know, in biblical terms we might call evil. Now, I don't believe in the devil, so let's get that out of the way. I believe that's a Christian archetype. That's not something that I subscribe to, but I do believe in evil, and it is an energy that I've encountered less than a handful of times in my life. So whenever I'm talking about sort of the darker sides of things, I'm not talking about Satanism, I'm not talking about inverted pentagrams and things like that. I find those things wholly unnecessary anyway. The type of magic that I do, I find the word magic a little bit difficult as well to kind of resonate with, because it does sound all a little bit Harry Potter and fairy tale. But say the type of energy work or magical working that I do is mainly probably what you would call folk magic. That isn't really a term that I was aware of until researching over the last couple of years into, you know, what is it that I am doing? What is it that I do have a tendency towards? You know, when I suddenly feel the urge to grab a rock and hold it and whisper something into it and then bury it in the ground, you know, what's that about? And I know a lot of my workings do come from this kind of urge to do something, you know, almost as if it's like this is how you need to solve this problem. And there's a lot of times that I don't reach for magical help. I think it, just like tarot, in my video about the tarot, you know, if we're always looking to magic, spirit to solve our problems for us, or to help us to solve problems, I think that, you know, we might be overusing those tools. I try not to overuse the tools. I always try to respect those tools and the spirits and guides that help me use them. So a lot of the folk magic that I have experience of is actually very similar to some of the magic that one might call hoodoo. So I've got a book that I've been reading about hoodoo magic. I've noticed there's so much correlation in the way that I work with the elements in the main, and the way that I might prepare my space as well. That being said, obviously there's a lot of sort of deity work that I don't do that's very specific to that culture. And, you know, we have to be mindful of cultural appropriation as well, even when we're working with magic and spiritualism. So for example, I do try not to use sage. I've still got a sage smudge stick, which I'll use up, but I try not to buy more sage. I try to use my own local herbs because that is better for cultures and it's better for the environment as well. I tend to work with sympathetic magic. So that's where, and I'm sure most of you already know this, but for those of you that don't, it's where, say, an object, say a rock, you kind of draw a relationship with that item to something else. So the rock, for example, could be me, it could represent me, and it's like drawing a relationship between one thing and another thing. And I have a video of me actually doing sympathetic magic from several years ago, from 2022 actually, and I don't know why I filmed it. I don't know if maybe at the time I was thinking this could be interesting, maybe I would post it on YouTube, and then never did it. I don't know, but I just thought, I'm sure I filmed this for some reason, but it is the most successful working I've ever done. I'm not going to go into details about exactly what it was about, but I'm going to show it at the end for you. I thought it might be a point of interest. So I think that there are primarily sort of 3 different types of energy, and this is where it might be controversial and you may have different ideas, which is obviously welcome. But my sort of way of working is to think of 3 different types of energy, which is neutral energy, which kind of hasn't been assigned a direction yet, light energy or positive, harmonious, good energy, for want of a better word, and then there's, you know, the more negative, malevolent energy. When I was sort of thinking about this before filming, I was going to just talk about neutral energy and how basically if all energy starts as being neutral, you then, you know, with your practice, you direct that energy using your will and your intention, potentially also invoking other deities, spirits, you know, to help you to achieve a change, to achieve an outcome. But actually, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking, no, there are times when I've definitely just encountered a very malevolent energy, and also where I've encountered the opposite, you know, a very benevolent energy. And so I thought about this and I thought possibly, you know, that energy had been created from neutral energy in the beginning, but I don't know. I don't know where that energy came from in the beginning. And so for me, just simplistically, it's easier to work with the notion of there being generally neutral energy that can be directed, and there also being energy which has already been given or already is darker in nature, more malevolent, as well as there being energy that's more benevolent. That just is an easier way of working from my perspective. What I will say is that I believe that pretty much all energies can be manipulated into, you know, its equal and opposite. So a benevolent energy could be transmuted into a malevolent energy and vice versa. And obviously neutral energy, as I've already said, can be directed one way or another. I've often thought of it as being like cutlery, like a knife or something, you know, that can be used to make the most wonderful meal for somebody to share with your family and friends and community. Or, you know, that knife can be wielded for very harmful purposes. And I think that in a similar way, that's how I would describe energy, but really it's the intention. It's also mind. It's how we direct our mind, our will. And what is willpower? I think that's something very hard to describe, but I think it's a combination of our obsession, our mind, that pointy part of our brains and where we're focusing our intention, as well as the emotion that's underpinning that as well. And when we bring those things together and we send that into a very singular direction and we're very focused, then I think that's probably a good description of willpower. I also feel that just like in life, where we see predators and prey and we see power battles in the environment and in sort of the circle of life and these hierarchies in nature, so I think that's the same with a magical working. So if, you know, a malevolent energy has been sent your way, like what we might call a hex or a curse, although I don't actually use those terms either, but, you know, an intention from somebody else towards you that's very, very focused on causing you harm, then I think that, you know, if their willpower is stronger than yours, that's where you get into difficulty. Whereas if you've got quite a resilient willpower, then we're able to use things like defensive workings to send that energy back or to transmute it into something more benevolent. So now I've introduced the topic from my perspective, I'm going to go through a few light magic workings that I've done. So as I've said, my practice is usually working with light for benevolent reasons. So this will usually be directing the energy in an ethical way towards a benevolent outcome and one that doesn't interfere with somebody else's consent. Sometimes I will also use what I would call, and this is where I might get a bit woo-woo for some people, but messages that I've received through my spirit guides or through my practice, and I will follow that message. Now, obviously, you have to have a degree of awareness and faith in the energy that you're dealing with, the spirit guide, for want of a better term, that you're communicating with, because otherwise you could be led down a dark path. But I think, you know, actually that's fairly obvious because you can sense the energy of what you're working with. And if something has got a malicious intention at the end of it, then I think we know this probably isn't something that's going to take us on a light path. So I tend to work in a very ethical way. So I work in a primarily light-based way. So I think these days there are many different labels. There are types of crafts and witches that I've never even heard of, if I'm honest with you. And I'm not sort of denigrating those titles. They're meaningful to those individuals. But for me, I don't feel the need to sort of wear a label or a hashtag. You know, I don't really need to call it anything. I think I've just tried to find something to explain it to you. So folk magic, primarily, in my understanding of folk magic, is that it's really done by folk, by the people. And it usually had like a practical or useful purpose. And, you know, in the past there were cunning folk, and I'm going to do a video around witchcraft trials and cunning folk in a couple of weeks' time. So I won't go into that into depth here, but essentially there were people who were said to be able to use their skills and their powers to do benevolent things and also to prevent curses, hexes and witches. But we won't go into that part in this episode. So basically, you know, cunning folk, folk magic, this is really about using energies and working with what you had around you, really. So the earth, the elements, you know, the weather, and bringing these energies together to be able to help crops to grow. And a lot of these things would focus on what would be most destructive to a community, say back in the sort of 1600s, and that would have been famine. So if your crops failed, it would have been pestilence, so diseases if someone fell ill and that spread throughout the community, and it would have been things like, you know, baneful magic, which often came from a sort of Christianization of previous beliefs. So, you know, those cunning folk and folk magic was usually related to that, and it was about helping the harvest. It was about healing people of, you know, different maladies, different diseases, and trying to prevent that spread within the villages and the towns. And it was also about warding off evil and doing protective magic. Now, my family history to me is interesting. On one side of the family, there is a spiritualism type connection. On the other side of the family there isn't, but there is a very strong connection to agriculture, and it's actually through that side of my family that I feel I've picked up a lot of the folk magic side, whereas the seeing things and hearing things, the sort of clairsentience, clairvoyance side, and the tarot side, I think comes through the other line of my family, and the herbalism as well. So although I have, you know, quite an interesting split between a sort of an open-minded spiritualist to agnostic side of my family, and then a more Christian side of my family to, again, a more agnostic or even atheist side of the family, I actually feel that there probably at some point through one side was a connection to agricultural magic. Now, the reason I say that is because in my family line, when I look back at my family tree, almost all of them are farmers involved in agriculture, and a lot of the instincts that I have and the way that I work is very much related to the land, to the elements. So that would be very aligned to that type of folk magic. Now, as I've said, you know, there are a lot of things that, even though I grew up with, you know, a member of my family being more affiliated with what we would now call spiritualism and the spiritualist church, so spirits and tarot and divination and seances and that side of things, in terms of actual magic, it was sometimes people in their circle that I would have contact with that would do things like a magical working, but I wasn't really exposed to that. And it's as I've gotten older, I've always known anyway, even as a young child, how to work with certain pieces of land, say, it's difficult to describe, but, you know, I'd have an understanding of how something connected to something else is probably the best way that I can explain. I would also have visions of things happening, a strong sense that something was going to happen. So, you know, a strong sense that my cat, for example, had cancer. And we took him to the vet, and the vets did their tests and there was nothing. And then 6 months later, they found he was riddled with tumours, which obviously didn't spring up overnight. And I'd kept on saying as a young child, I know that there's cancer in the stomach. Like, I could see it. It's hard to describe. So in that way, it was always there. It was always present. But as I got older, I sort of matured as well. And I was able to then use what we would call sympathetic magic. So there are times when I have looked up a spell, you know, out of interest over recent years, much more recent years. But prior to that, and when I didn't have a smartphone and the internet, and apart from YouTube, I like to stay away really from social media and from technology. I'm much more earthy. But yeah, I didn't really look anything up. I just knew how to work with these things, and I've sort of developed that from there. And then in recent years, I spent some time reading some books and watching some YouTube channels which were related to Conjure work in New Orleans and hoodoo, and I saw a real synchronicity, a real similarity between what they were doing and what I knew how to do. Things that I'd never heard of anybody working with. So one of the things I work with is eggshells, although very carefully, because you have to be careful of salmonella. But, you know, I've never heard anyone say that on any of these videos, but you really do. But I do work with eggshells, and I've always worked with them for protection work. I'd never read that anywhere. No one had ever shown me. And the way that I work with them is in such a way that's very similar to conjure work, which is also, you know, another type of folk magic essentially. So, you know, I think that there is a practice that can be taught and learnt, but also there's sort of something inside that already knows from the generations before in the ancestral line how to work with these materials. Now, interestingly, I did look up the dictionary definition of folk magic, and I wasn't very happy about it. So this is from dictionary.com. I've just looked it up now, so I make sure I get it exactly right. So folk magic, noun, any attempt to practice charms, spells, etc., to control events or people. Now, I don't know how you feel about that dictionary.com definition, but for me, that's not what magic is. So it's not about control for me. You know, if someone was baking a cake because they want the outcome to be a lovely cake to feed their family, we wouldn't say they're trying to control things. For me, these ingredients are around us all the time, these energetic ingredients. And, you know, we can utilize these to help us. And I don't think that's about having control. You know, we all want to remove obstacles in our lives, and if we don't use magic, we tend to try to do that in mundane ways. That isn't always a controlling behavior, and I don't think magic is a controlling thing at all. I guess what I'm saying is it depends on how you use your gifts. So if you want to be controlling and you've got a controlling nature about you, you're going to do controlling magical workings. If you're not seeking to control, but you're more wanting to harmonize, then you're going to have a more harmonious magical working. So one of the ways that I work is with the elements, and I'm sure that most of you who do practice magic will be able to relate to this. But I don't know if I work with the elements in the same way that you do. And I think that's what's quite interesting about this conversation. So I did do a little bit of research to find out, you know, how do other people work with these elements? And I could see similarities. But for example, with water, a lot of people use water for cleansing. Whereas for me, I use water as a movement. So for me, if I'm trying to move an issue along, if I'm trying to remove obstacles, I will work with water. And my most successful working is what I'm going to include at the end of this video. And it's not one that I've reconstructed, like it is an actual video of that specific working. And within like 24 hours, this extremely stubborn problem that I had that had been an issue for 8 months, in under 24 hours was removed. So it worked very, very well. When I work with air, I tend to work a bit like the tarot. It's more like a communication, and also it can be for cleansing, so the atmosphere. So you've probably seen North American indigenous practices of using sage and blowing the energy and removing the energy, often using like an abalone shell or something to cleanse a space. I do find smoke and air very effective for that. Usually when I work with the element of air, it's much more receptive. So it's usually connected to the weather. And by this, I mean, I'll go and stand outside with my dog. And, you know, most nights I'm just standing outside with my dog. But sometimes the wind will stir up, the energy builds, the energy moves in a certain way. The birds come and they look at me and I sort of receive a message. Now, obviously, you're going to think I'm completely bonkers if you're not sort of this way inclined already, but I'm just explaining to you how it works for me. And I've kind of always known if there's going to be a sudden shift, if there's going to be a sudden change, you know, like a tower moment if you do your tarot. I've been able to sense that through the wind, or I felt like spirit communicates with me and the energies are telling me something through the wind. And I don't know if you've watched that movie Chocolat. It's from many years ago now, but I think it's based on the book. But the way they filmed part of that, where she talks about the wind coming to sort of move them on, and also a little bit of practical magic actually, but mainly it's Chocolat that I'm thinking of. To me, that's the closest thing that I can kind of think of that describes this energy. It's so hard to describe, but yes, it's like being communicated with through the wind, like something higher, a higher power will sort of tell me what I need to know through the breeze. Now, I've been exploring TikTok, and there's a lot of people with long fingernails and candles and you know, lots of sort of chanting and things on there, which is like fine, because that stuff does work in my opinion. But actually, you know, you can work quite simply with these tools. You know, I don't think we need to be fancy with anything. If you want to be fancy, be fancy. You know me, I'm theatrical sometimes. So, you know, I'm not sort of dissing anybody at all, but we don't have to be, is what I'm saying. On social media and Instagram, obviously a lot of that's about visual things. A lot of it's about show. But actually, when we're really working with these energies respectfully, I don't think it is. There are lots of groups I've seen that, you know, practice sort of as a coven, for example, and it's all very showy. But actually, I think some of the most effective workings are very, very simple. They don't use lots of different ingredients. They don't involve a lot of complicated words. They don't rhyme. You know, a lot of spells have always been traditionally a bit like Disney. They've all had to rhyme, but a spell doesn't have to rhyme to work. And yeah, you know, I think one of the things we see the most is candle magic. And I think candle magic is very effective. Now, I did have a conversation with somebody. I won't describe them, but basically they were a practitioner of magic, and they spent a lot of time in New Orleans. And they were talking to me about candles, and they were saying that actually the colour of the candle is irrelevant. It's about the fire and the intention and the energy of the fire. Whereas, you know, other people, including myself, do work with different coloured candles. Now, perhaps that just helps me to focus on something. But yeah, I do agree with that person. You don't have to get hung up on the colour of the candle. You know, if say you want to do a money spell and you don't have a green candle, and you don't have a white candle, which could be anything, and you've only got a red candle, you could still use the red candle, you know. And in fact, you know, for me, I think red is quite an activated colour, so I think it does help with things like that. But, you know, the point is, you can give through sympathetic magic, you can give the energy to that object to do what you want it to do. So it kind of doesn't matter what colour it is anyway. But I do use candles a lot in magic. I do find that inscribing them, using oils with them carefully, obviously, does work very well. But in the main, what's most important to me with the candle is having a very clear intention. Not having a candle that burns for days and days and days and days. You know, a birthday candle works very, very well. Or those sort of smaller candles that are about this big, you know, sort of the same size as my hand. One that will sort of burn within an hour and 20 minutes. You know, I think they're very effective. So there are two primary ways that I work with candles. One I haven't seen anybody else do, but maybe this is another one of those things that lots of people have been doing for eons and I just don't know about it. But I will pull energy out of myself, put it in the candle and burn it off. So there was a time in my life when I was feeling extremely heavy, very depressed, very down, and I tried so many things. I'd, you know, actively seen counsellors, therapists, I tried medication. It went on for a couple of years, and you know, it was very heavily linked to trauma in this case. And no matter what I tried, nothing helped. And it felt like my insides were almost vacant of anything, like no joy, no sorrow, no anger, no nothing. It's just empty. And I had this sudden urge to take a candle and put it against my body where I felt this heaviness, this weight. So there are two different occasions when I've done this. One was, it was more of a mental thing where something was going on and on and on in my mind and I just couldn't settle my mind. And so I put the candle against my head. It's going to sound strange. I held it against my head. And another time was when I held it against my, sort of near my heart, near my chest, where I could feel this heaviness. And I imagined pulling the energy and pushing it into the candle. And as I did this, I really did see energy moving into this candle. And then I pushed and pushed and pushed, and then I pulled the candle away. I sealed the candle with the flame at the bottom. So I sealed the energy in the candle, put the candle upright, and then I instructed the candle to burn this energy, to release it. And then I imagined it being transmuted into white light, and I opened a window and allowed it to do that. And I repeated that over 3 days because, you know, the burden in me was so heavy. And I found nothing happened whilst the candle was burning, but within 20 minutes of that candle having burnt all the way down, and for me that's very important, I will never interrupt a candle working. So I will never snub it out. I will never stop it halfway through. For me, it has to burn all the way through and be done for the spell to work. And I think that's very important, although I know that people work differently. So I think this is a very individual thing about your focus. But yeah, within 20 minutes of that first candle being reduced completely, it was like the windows and doors of my soul had opened and all of that energy had just left. And I did it again for a couple more days after, because I still felt a little bit of residual heaviness, and that was it. And you know, I also took actions in my life, of course, as well, and this is important. You know, we don't just rely on a wish or a whim or a magical working. We need to align our actions with that focus as well. But yeah, for me, it was that working that really was the main thing that helped, as well as some actions I did in my life, but primarily that working. So I will use candles sometimes to burn away unwanted energy in that regard, like too much emotional heaviness and too much mental fog or mental burden. This is harder than I thought, explaining something that you always do secretly. So the second way that I work with candles is probably similar to what you've seen already, and this is where I take a petition, I carve symbols into the candle. I might use some oils as well, although I don't find it totally necessary, and sometimes it makes a darn mess if there's been lots of dyes used in the candle as well. And then I put the, well, I'm careful how I write the petition. So if I want something to be coming towards me, I write my petition. There's some other things I do with the writing I won't go into here, but I then fold it towards me. If it's something that I want to leave me, I fold it away from me, and I think that's very, very important with Sympathetic Magick. I then put my candle on top of it. So I've got like a circular candle holder, which I can put sort of pebbles and stones and other offerings around it very safely, and the candle then sits in the middle. And what I do is I will then put that candle on top of the paper. But in the past, when I didn't have that candle holder, I used to use a plate. I'd put the candle on the plate after lighting the bottom of the candle, making the wax melt so it sticks to the plate, and then I will let that burn down completely. And obviously I am always present for that. I would never leave that candle unattended. But what's really important, I feel, about working with any magical working, but particularly with candles, is that you have to trust that your working is done. So mote it be, you know, it is done. I release my will be done. Whatever it is that you say that sort of pinpoints that final act of your working, when you say it and when the candle burns down, it's done, it's happened, and you forget about it. And that's really, really important, as I say, for any working, but particularly for working with candles. I never interrupt the candle. So I've seen some people say you can kind of, you know, you can stop it and you can come back to it. I don't do that. So I've seen sort of big money candles, and I'm sure they work for people, but for me it doesn't. I need to work with my candle when I'm doing a working by burning it down in that moment. So I will tend to use things like birthday candles or birthday sized candles, hour and 20-minute burning candles, that sort of amounts, and that works really well for me. I tend to not like to use a pillar candle for something like that. I might use a pillar candle for something that I want to do over time. You know, so for a money spell, if you're wanting to kind of build up prosperity over time with Sympathetic Magick, I could see how that would align. But again, you know, if you want it to happen quite quickly, for me, using that shorter burning candle works really well. So I'm just thinking back to time. I have used, you know, those sort of pillar candles before for sort of an ongoing energy. But I think just looking back on it, I don't think it gave me anything extra than just using my short burning candle. So when I'm working with the element of earth, again, I don't know if this is how other magical practitioners use earth, but I do tend to use it for a grounding technique. I know that's very common, but I will sometimes take earth. If I'm working with a territorial working, so if I'm protecting land or territory or home, I might use, say, like a magical jar and put the earth in the jar and to protect that space. But also I might give something back to the energy of the earth and ask it to protect it for me. And so that could be things like ash. It could be a crystal that has a significant meaning. But I am careful, you know, one of the things that's important is when we put things back into nature, say when we're working with a river, and we give something to the river spirits, be careful if you do that. Or if we're burying something in the earth, you know, we don't want to be putting toxins into the earth or the river, and we don't want to transfer diseases from one location to another, you know, things like foot and mouth disease, that we have in this country, you know, so I'm very mindful of the countryside code and things like that when I do these things too. Usually I will work with whatever's already there, so I don't feel a need to sort of bring a crystal from home and bury it generally. What I'll do is I'll find a location that feels energetically right, if that makes sense, and I'll find something that's already there. So it could be like a hazelnut, it could be a pebble that's already there. I'll work with that, and then that can be buried in that location without transferring any diseases. Generally I focus on myself because that's most ethical. So, you know, to try and do something that creates a change that impacts somebody else, we are starting to go into an unethical territory. As I've said, if we were classifying me, I'd be more of a grey witch. You know, it makes me sound like Gandalf, doesn't it? But, you know, so yes, there are times when I have felt I've needed to handle something in relation to somebody else through magic, usually defensive spells, if somebody sent me something my way and I need to send that energy back. So obviously in those situations that affect somebody else, but I think very, very carefully before undertaking such a thing. I also feel that, you know, most of the time we don't need to affect other people, and just logically, you know, is it easier in life to change your own ways or to change somebody else? Well, it's easier to change your own ways, so magically it's the same. So if we work with our own energies and say we want more abundance coming to us, rather than being, say, competitive or jealous and wanting to take something from someone else, why don't we just work on building our own abundant energy? You know, if we take a really simple scenario, let's imagine that our partner cheats on us, and so we want to either visit a magical practitioner or do it ourselves and send them negative energy, something which I would caution, by the way. Yeah, you know, one could undertake that, but you're sending a lot of focus and a lot of energy towards somebody else when you could be using that energy and focus on your own life. So instead of sort of wanting to send them something negative, I think there's a degree of just trusting that usually the universe has a way of balancing things out. Now, you might not be aware of it, you might not see it in your lifetime, but trusting that it will happen is very important, because that's the same energy that you're working with when you are sending them something negative anyway. So if you trust it in that way, why don't we trust it to balance itself out? When we send something negative to someone else, there's that saying of, you know, what you send outwards comes back to you ×3. A lot of that is related to when you point. So if you point, hopefully you can see, you send energy in one direction, and then there's 3 fingers pointing right back towards you. So that's kind of where the whole thing of it being a rude to point comes from, is actually sort of based in what you send outwards comes back to you 3-fold. And usually when we're pointing at somebody, unless we're doing teaching and instruction, it's often sort of a negative thing, isn't it? So I believe this. I believe and have experienced that if you send something negative outwards, it will usually come back to you. Now, sometimes I think that's because magic spells sometimes involve a degree of sacrifice. So if it's something that you really, really want, sometimes, you know, say it's something unpleasant that you're wishing on somebody else, you have to be prepared for some of that energy to sort of manifest itself in your own life, because it's sympathetic, because it's joined, because there's a relationship. And so even if you cast a circle and you work with other entities to protect you and you do a lot of protective work, you know, if you're sending negative energy outwards, usually then you will be accepting that that's going to also come into your life because of the law of balances. Now, you might not agree with me in that. You might say that, you know, a different type of protective magic is all that's needed. But for me, I just feel that sending that sort of energy outwards comes with a lot of negative karma and negative energy for yourself. So why do it? You know, you're not helping yourself. And I just think in general, obsessing over somebody else, it's like you're giving them something. They're staying rent-free in your head, aren't they? Whereas you could take that energy and use it in your own life. So yes, take an example of, say, our partner cheats on us and we want to send them negative energy or hex them or something, or make sure that they're cheated on. I'd rather use that energy, instead of putting it in their pot for something that's going to happen to them, I'd rather put it in my pot. I'd rather think, right, what do I want? You know, sort of sometimes kill them with kindness. You know, the best type of revenge is to be successful yourself, you know, and so focus that energy just on yourself. They'll get to see you having your fabulous life, and eventually their karma will come for them anyway, in my opinion. I think that when we work magically and we work with spirit, we're basically working with invisible hands. So when we are taking care of something in our mundane world, in our mundane way, we're using our own hands, we're using our own tools. But when we are doing a magical working, we are partnering with spirits, and so we are working with invisible hands. And that is one of the ways that I approach what I'm doing. And that's also one of the reasons that I don't overuse my connection with spirit. So, you know, if I don't know what to have for my tea, I don't pull a tarot card. You know, it needs to be really, in my opinion, used for things that are kind of respectful of spirit. Otherwise, it's a bit like saying, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Or constantly poking somebody, saying, can you help me with this? Can you help me with that? And at some point, you know, you might find that the connection's kind of severed for a time. You know, the energy goes away. If you use any divination tools, particularly the I Ching is a really fantastic divination tool in my experience. And that's an oracle that will just tell you, you asked too many times, drop it. No, I'm not giving you any more. And when I work with spirit, and although spirit's slightly different to the I Ching, I believe, you know, I think when we work with the oracle, we're working with something slightly different to what we're working with when we're doing magical workings. That's the sense that I get. I still kind of use the same premise, you know, it's almost like working with a friend. You know, if I respect you, I'm not going to keep asking you all the time to help me. I've got to figure some stuff out on my own. But I think when we're working with spirit and we're working with those invisible hands, we're trusting that we're working together towards this outcome. And that's why, again, at the end of a working, it's so important to just trust that it's done, that it's already been achieved. I think it's really important just to say that, you know, I'll never break a human law in the pursuit of an outcome or whilst doing magic. You know, throughout history, and some of the texts and some of the deities we use come from ancient history, but some of the practices that human beings did when working with those deities are not acceptable, like human sacrifice, animal sacrifice, you know, taking a life in aid of achieving a magical outcome is not okay. It shouldn't happen. And, you know, I will never work in such a way that I break human laws or, you know, create harm in such a way to an individual or an animal or something like that. I think that's just really important for me to say, and I never encourage that you do that. As I said, I do work on the premise that what you give out, you get back in return, and it usually comes back threefold. Now, does it come back really 3 times more? No, I wouldn't say so, but I think the point is it comes back more. You know, you can be careful what you wish for. Even if you're wishing for something benevolent, be careful what you wish for, because you need to make sure you're being very clear with your intention. Because, you know, you might wish for a windfall, a load of money to come in, and that might happen. And you might get a phone call to say, you know, a relative suddenly passed away and you've inherited. You know, I don't want to scare anybody, but I do believe that is how it can go sometimes. So you have to be really careful about what you're trying to change, because some things are not intended to be changed, and you might get quite a strong pushback from the energies about that too. And sometimes, even if it's not a malicious undertaking, if you're really trying to change something that's not supposed to be changed, you know, you can get such a pushback that it can be a very, very difficult process. And sometimes it's better to just go, okay, this is not how things are intended to be, and I respect that and I accept it and I leave it. And that's, I think, where that notion of control comes in. You know, we talked about that dictionary.com definition is, you know, I don't think we should be using these gifts as a way to control everything so we get what we want all of the time. There is a natural cycle to life, and as a pagan, you know, I work with that, I honour that, I respect it. There is a cycle of life and death. So you know, if a relative that I loved was passing away, I wouldn't try to use magic to stop that happening if that's its natural course most of the time. If I felt that it was something, and I say feel, I don't mean like my own emotions, I can't quite describe it, but sometimes I might get a strong sense that healing is appropriate here. But there are also times when healing's not. And I think as humans, you know, we're very focused on finding cures for everything and almost everlasting life. Thousands of years ago, the Egyptians wanted everlasting life, and I don't think we're so different now. But, you know, think about what would really happen if we all lived forever, and how would the planet survive? I don't think the planet would. And so I honour that natural cycle. And so sometimes, even with the best intentions, we can do harm. And when we are working with those invisible hands, when we're working with spirit, and when we are directing energy, it is important to have an understanding of that, and to have an understanding of ethics, and not morality from a sort of biblical sense, but just sometimes it's not right for human beings to take the reins. So on that note, I'm going to leave you with a clip of my magical working, which is all about moving an obstacle. So as I say, I had a very stubborn problem, and I had a strong energy that I did need to shift this problem, that this is sort of like a spiritual test for me in my life, and it had been going on for 8 months. So I had this sort of sense that this is the way to approach it. So I'm going to include some of that now, and I will see you next week for my episode, which is going to be about darker magic. So I hope you found this interesting. If so, please do like if you like, and subscribe if you vibe, and I shall see you next week. Okay, so some ingredients that you're going to need for this spell include 3 runes, but you can draw them if you want to. I'll go into that in a moment. The runes that I've chosen are Legus, Wunjo and Berkana. Some lavender, you could use rose petals. Some sage, obviously some matches to burn the sage. A shell, some purified water. Flames, candles. Quartz, amethyst, fluorite, rose quartz, smoky quartz. Some nice calm but warming lighting, very important. A pink candle, pink Himalayan salt, and a rose. Cleanse this space. May my heart be buoyant and light. May this salt protect the love that's coming in to my life. And although my heart be open, may it be protected from heartbreak. These represent the obstacles. Every petal represents my heart opening. I give myself to love. I believe in love. Every petal represents my heart opening. I give myself to love. I am love. Every petal represents my heart opening. I'm open to love and to giving and receiving love. Every petal represents my heart opening. I'm open to love. I give and receive love. Ocean of my heart, I am receptive and I am listening. I am listening. Lagos, you represent my emotions like the lake, the tides of the lake, ebbing and flowing. May you calm my emotions. May you transmute my resentment and my pain. Let my anguish leave my heart and my body and my mind. And may your tides bring in abundant love. Wunjo, I have chosen you to help me bring a joyful love into my life, a connectedness, unity, joy, laughter, light happiness. Berkana, I choose you for rebirth. As the tide comes in, may you birth to me new love. And may love bloom in my heart again, like the bud of a flower opening in the springtime. May sunlight come into my heart and renew me. May love be rebirthed. Barriers to love remove themselves. 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 Tide going out, I feel a situation leave me. Tide going out, I let you take the energy with you. Tide going out, I surrender to your mighty waves. I love myself. I love myself. I love myself. I am love.